Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Before to start, thanks to Tiziano for this invitation to this interesting workshop. We would like to talk about space beyond platform with a focus on Airbnb and the spatio-temporal evolution of Airbnb in Italy. And before to start talk about Airbnb, I would like to focus our attention on the space, the geography of this platform. And I would like to show two very quick examples, one from Twitter and second from Wikipedia. The map behind me illustrates us some 1 year of Twitter activities here in Siena. So basically each dot represents one tweet sent by some Twitter users here in Siena from somewhere. And this is a very basic representation. We have no analysis here, no true analysis. There is no clustering, no density, but just a very easy distribution of a visualization of these tweets. And what is interesting here is that we can easily note that there are some parts of the city that are more digitally augmented than other parts of the cities. And with a big jump, if we extend this analysis at worldwide scale, we can see here that, again, some parts of the world are more digitally augmented than other parts of the world, of course. And why these two quick examples are interesting? Because even if we agree or don't agree about the fact that this digitally mediated environment may impact with our life, what we can see here is that this content has distinctly geographies. And this is a key point also when we analyze data from Airbnb. So where is Airbnb? Where this digitally mediated information happen? In geography we say always everything happens somewhere. And this is true for all the other platforms that we can consider today. This is a quite famous street in Florence near San Lorenzo. And probably here we have some Airbnb, some people that sleep in an Airbnb, some people that tweet, that take pictures, then upload pictures on Wikipedia, on Instagram, on Flickr, that describe these places by adding one page on Wikipedia. So it seems that apparently we are living in an increasingly on-life ecosystem where it is very, very hard to distinguish between our life online and our life offline, because we have always a smartphone also here in our pockets. And this is true also for one of the most popular platforms in the world, Wikipedia. The map behind me illustrates all the geotagged articles from different versions of the platform. So basically the first map shows us all the articles written in English. The last map in yellow shows us all the articles written in Korean. You can see that we have also here distinctly geographies, of course. And we have no time here to deepen this analysis, but what is interesting here is that if we agree about the fact that we are living in an increasingly digital world, then there are some important questions about who owns this information, who controls this information, who can access, who cannot access this digital mediated environment, and where this digitally mediated environment may impact with our life. So my point is the geography that is behind the platform, because there is always a geography, something that happens spatially, and we can measure spatially. So we consider this such as the context of our research on the aerification of cities. So why Airbnb? Because this digitally mediated platform is global, is growing, because we have 4 million Airbnb listings worldwide, more than 200 million total guest arrivals since 2008, and our country, Italy, is the third market on the platform by the number of listings. So, considering this context and this data, we focus on 2 points. We explore 2 points. The spatial distribution, the spatial evolution of the short-term rental system from Airbnb, and economic impact of Airbnb in our cities.
Right. Hopefully, right, this works. Thanks a lot. Right, so I'll briefly go through what the main findings from this study that we did have been, so that we can then discuss the... Oh, sorry. My voice. Is my voice okay? Good. So, I'll tell you a bit what this was about, and then we can discuss what this particular platform does and what the issues that this particular platform presents. So I'll go through what we did. So as Antonello said, as geographers, we were mainly interested in the spatial effects, so in the effect that the interactions taking place on the platforms have on actual space, so real space where people live. So the first thing that we looked at was the distribution of STRs, which means short-term rentals, the flats that are rented for a short term. And the other thing that we were interested in was the economic impact of all this. So who actually benefits from Airbnb, who doesn't benefit from Airbnb, and how the revenues and how the economic impact is shared between the participants and the non-participants as well. So what we did was basically get some data, because you need data to do this kind of study. And what we did was essentially scrape the website. We scraped the Airbnb website for data, and we essentially collected all the listings that were present on the platform at 2 different points in time in 13, relative to 13 cities in this country. The cities are listed there. So we did this exercise in February 2016 and February 2017, so that we had 2 comparable date sets. We collected the data in the table to the left. So we got, for each listing on the platform, we got who the host was, what the price charged per night was, how many bedrooms the property had, how many reviews the property attracted in each year that we considered, and then we collected the geographical position of every Airbnb listings. So I assume that you all know what Airbnb is, okay? I didn't mention that, but that's safe to assume. Right, so this is, we did this twice, in 2016 and 2017. We run this exercise and we ended up with stuff like this. And stuff like this, okay? So this is Florence, this is Rome, and what you see there, all the little dots are flats or rooms offered on Airbnb. So the first thing that jumps to the eye is that there's many of them. So in Rome, there are 21,000 listings, the absolute majority of which is entire flats. And the same goes for Florence. Okay, so in Florence you have 8,000 and nearly 3 out of 4 are entire flats. So the purple thing that you see buried underneath the dots there is the shape of Florence historical center. So the bit of Florence which is between the medieval walls. Because the area of the cities that we were mainly interested into are the historical centers. Because this was part of a work that we had ongoing about the transformations of Italian historical centers and things that are happening in them. So thanks to the data from Airbnb, we could quantify how big a portion of these cities, how big a chunk of the city is essentially not available for residents anymore because it exists on the platform. It's basically dedicated to short-term visitors. And we will see why we believe this might be a problem. So from this big number of dots that you see here, we decided to quantify how big a chunk of the city goes into that. So we took the, sorry, I changed this, but not this other one. So what we did was get data from the census. So the Italian census last was in 2011. And we got the number of, basically we got a measure of the housing stock in the historic centers of the cities that we considered. So the census keeps track of how many flats, basically, how many properties, how many dwellings exist in every city. So the first thing that we did, we made a division, essentially. So we established how much of the housing stock goes into Airbnb. And the numbers are quite large, as you can see, because in Florence, which is our winner here, our champion, we've got almost 18% of the entire housing stock of the historical center that is probably permanently offered for short-term rent on Airbnb. Okay, this is a lot. This is one flat in 6, one flat in 5 almost, in the historical center of Florence, which is not available to residents but goes to tourists essentially. In Venice, we've got quite a large proportion. In Rome as well. So Rome has a huge historical center, and nearly 10% of the entire historic center of Rome is on Airbnb. So the rest of the Italian cities go following. And as you can see, between 2016 and 2015, they've all increased, essentially. So this means that Airbnb and the people who use it are eating, what word do we want to use? But they are taking an increasing portion of our cities for short term. This is the increase between 2016 and 2017, so it's increasing everywhere. In some places it's increasing more than other places. But yes, this is the first finding that we thought was quite relevant about this, because nobody had figured how big the phenomenon is. One other thing that we noticed, as I told you before, that most of what goes into Airbnb is not rooms anymore, it's entire homes, entire flats. So being geographers, we had some fun playing with this data, because even if before you start discussing the problem, before you start addressing the issues that might come from these dynamics, the data tell us something about our cities. Only looking at the data, we can get an idea of how a city, okay, the word will never come to me. But what the city looks like. So in Florence, these are Florence, Milan, and Rome. In Florence, you see most of the Airbnb listings are concentrated in the old town. So in this picture, all the bars, the height of the bars represent the density of listings. So how many there are in a square meter or a square kilometer, and the color represents the number. So you see very different cities there. Florence has a certain shape, but most is concentrated in the center. Milan and Rome have very different shapes. So in Milan, you've got a center which is almost empty of listings, but you've got areas that emerge which are areas that have a sort of connotation in people's minds. So Naviglia and Isola, for those of you who are familiar with Milan, are very up-and-coming neighborhoods where you have some gentrification, you have young people living, and things like that. Rome has a different shape, a third kind of shape. You have a spike towards the center, and then you have valleys of areas which are probably uninteresting, are probably not suitable for tourists. You need some imagination to interpret this kind of data. But then you have another spike around the Vatican, and this other spike to the right is the San Lorenzo area where many students are. So you have sort of emergent shape of the city that you can analyze just by looking at data from this kind of platform. So the things that we were most interested in was, as I said, the spatial distribution and the economic impact. And we wanted to make sense of the phenomenon as well. So we asked ourselves what the drivers of these numbers essentially were. So why there are so many in Florence, so many in Rome, in Venice, and less in other places? And the answer is obviously tourism. So this shows that there exists a very strong correlation between the number of tourists that every year visit a particular city and the number of properties offered on Airbnb. So this was an easy one almost, because we could all have figured that. But it's quite striking because you see that it's global tourism basically that drives the phenomenon of homes going into Airbnb. This is something that journalists find quite difficult to understand, because they all like to claim that Airbnb created this phenomenon of the centers emptying of residents and homes going into short term. But it's in fact a wider phenomenon that creates this, which is tourism, a much bigger thing to control and address. So going back to the spatial distribution of Airbnb, we focused on a couple of cities because we were interested in this set of phenomena. So as we were suspecting, most of the properties being offered on Airbnb are concentrated in the historic centers, as we saw in the picture before, especially in certain cities. So this is Florence, where you have 63% of all the properties offered on Airbnb within the center. We also tried and get an estimation of the demand, because we wanted to be able to say something about the economic dynamics. So we asked ourselves if offer and demand went together. So because we collected reviews from each property, from each listing on the platforms, we could tell where people liked to go, where the properties with more reviews were. And so, as you can see, there is a disproportion between the number of properties offered and the number of reviews towards the center. This tells us that people prefer to go into properties which are in the center rather than places which are outside of the center. Okay? Right, so we did the same in Milan, and you have a similar dynamic there in Milan and Rome. So this is what came out of it. So because we are talking about platforms and data and the role that these things might have, think about how all this stuff might be important for a town planner. I know that I don't think any of you is in architecture or planning or urbanism, but try and put yourself in the mindset of some local administration who has to plan for services, plan for urban design, how this kind of stuff might be important to them. One other thing that we were very interested in, and also surprised us in terms of the results that we got, was the economic inequality that that this kind of platform seems to reproduce. We don't know, but there certainly is a certain deal of inequality. And I'll tell you about it. So one thing that we did with the data, we tried to estimate how much revenues each host and each individual property generated in the years that we considered. Okay? So what we did, we took the reviews that every property had in each of the years considered. We multiplied them by the price that every property was charging per night. And then we multiplied by 3, assuming that an average stay is of 3 nights. It's probably an underestimation, but we wanted to be cautious. We augmented it by a little factor, assuming that not all of those who go into an Airbnb leave a review. So we have a proportion of 10% or 15% of people who don't leave a review. So with this simple formula, we could get an estimation of how much every host made in the previous year with their flat on Airbnb. So because we have all the IDs, which is a number, but we know which host corresponds to which property. I'll go back to this in a bit. We could estimate how the revenues were distributed between the hosts. So again, we calculated how much everyone might have made in the year before, and then we plotted it in a simple plot like this. And this plot shows the distribution of revenues between hosts. Okay, so this tells you that in the city of Rome in 2016, you had 2,600 hosts. Hosts are the people who offer their home on Airbnb, who made essentially less than 5,000 euros, okay, in the whole year. And then you had 1,100 who made between 5,000 and 10,000, and so on and so forth. So that tells you that you have 2 people and 8 people down there who made more than 80,000, sorry. So the summary there tells you that the person who made the most in 2016 made 400,000 euros. But then the average person offering their home on Airbnb, the median host, we say, only made 5,000. Okay, so this is a huge inequality between those who make a lot of money and those who make very little money. We also calculated an inequality index, which is basically a number that tells you how unevenly wealth is distributed. Okay, so that particular inequality index is called the Gini index. Some of you might be familiar with that. Essentially, when Gini is 1, it means that all the wealth is concentrated, but basically one individual possesses all the wealth in a system. And when the index is 0, it means that the wealth is evenly distributed by between all the participants. So in that case, we have 0.62. That means, as you see, it's all concentrated in the hands, so to say, of very few people. So this puzzled us to some extent because the rhetoric attached to the notion of sharing economy is mostly a rhetoric of, sharing and what's yours is mine. We share the benefits, we divide things, but that doesn't seem to be the case, does it? One thing that we noticed is that among those people there who make a lot of money, there is quite a substantial amount of hosts which list a large number of properties. So there's one individual who has some 200 homes in Florence alone, okay? So we went to see who these people were, and we ended up with things like this, or these. So what these people are is essentially, they're not people, they're agencies. So on top of Airbnb, within the platform, there are big agencies, sometimes international agencies, which list huge numbers of properties in different cities across the world as well for short-term rental on Airbnb. So what we found is basically a double level of intermediation. Okay, so the promise of this kind of technology to some extent was that of removing the intermediary. But what we see is essentially different levels of intermediaries surfacing up, popping up. So what we made all sorts of conjectures about financialization of housing and this kind of stuff, which I spare you. But the take-home information is that you have the same kind of dynamic, even if you don't consider these big hosts that have lots of properties. So this is the same kind of diagram that you saw before, listing revenues for individual flats. Okay, so this tells you that again in Rome you have 1,000 flats which make very little, and you have very few flats which make lots of money. And it's still very unequal. Okay, so this is probably a general economic dynamic. So those of you who are familiar with the Pareto law, the 80-20 law, which tells you that 20% of the population own 80% of the wealth, it's the same thing that goes on here. Okay, in the sharing platform, the wealth is appropriated by a small number of players, of participants. And this is a first layer of inequality that we found in the platform. But when we went on and tried to understand who or which ones the ones and twos that you see down there are, we found out that most of those flats that make lots of money are again concentrated in the center of the cities. So, okay, this is the big picture of all the cities that we considered, and you have more or less the same stuff going on, okay? So we looked at space. Wealth, revenues from Airbnb are very unequally distributed between the hosts, between the flats, but they're all unevenly distributed spatially, because the flats that make the most of the revenues are concentrated towards the center. Okay? So this tells you that the further you go from the center of town, the less you make on Airbnb. Okay? So you've got spatial inequality there. And one thing that we can say about this country is that the people who own homes and flats in the historic center of cities are generally, well, not generally the poorest, are they? So you probably have a sort of reproduction of inequality, because those who are making the most of the money are those who already own more money. And this is a second layer of inequality. Before we go to the conclusions, I'd like to go back to this bit here, which is a bit scary, but it's really not. What we tried to do here, because we had all this data, okay, and data are useful to understand things, to understand dynamics. So we got the picture of how things are at the moment, but we wanted to know if we could somehow predict what's going to happen next year. If we could explain why some cities, so we know why some cities have more than others, and that's because of tourists, but what can we explain why there's a bigger increase in some cities than others? So this is the conjecture that we made. This is the thing that we thought. It's probably, we thought that it might be dependent on one very important measure, which has a very important consequence on the shape of cities and the social structure of cities. Is it because Airbnb is very convenient compared to traditional renting? So do property owners decide to go into Airbnb because they can make more money compared to what they could make if they rented out their property to somebody living in the property? Could this be the case? So you see the implication here. The implication is that this might make the rentals, the traditional rentals, higher, because now if you have to rent a flat and you have to compete with this, which makes more money for your landlord, and this in turn could generate sort of depopulation of the centers, of the town centers, residents living. And then you have a paradox, because you have the town center where people go on Airbnb because they can experience the culture, the atmosphere of the locals. So compared to a hotel, Airbnb gives you that, gives you the authenticity. But if there are no residents left, where's the authenticity? If you are among your fellow tourists, there is, it's not authentic anymore. So our conclusion here was that there is probably a strong correlation between the amount of money that you can make compared to the amount of money that you can make with traditional rent. But you also have to consider the density of properties in a particular area and some sort of a measure of demand. So obviously it's not only if you can make more money compared to traditional rent that you decide to put your home on Airbnb. It's also if there aren't too many already. And it's essentially, that is the thing. So the take-home conclusion here was that city centers have probably a sort of carrying capacity. There is a limit above which you can't go. And we're in the process of establishing what that carrying capacity is, so we can say what happens after a certain threshold. So, but anyway, if you calculate that formula, you see that you have the strong correlation with that index that we made, considering economic advantage over long-term rentals and emptiness measure and density measure, that more or less explains the increases. So you've got that number here, and the increase in listings between 2016 and 2015 and 2016. So the higher the number is there, and the higher the increase is. So we believe that we may be on track finding the dynamic of this phenomenon. One other thing that we, as geographers, we are interested in this kind of stuff. So we showed how most of the listings are concentrated in the center, but a dynamic that we discovered in the diachronic measure, so to say, is that the phenomenon is expanding, so it's going beyond the center. So in some cities you have the phenomenon that increasing the listings outside of the center produces more reviews outside of the centers. So this particular thing, the importance of this particular finding might not seem obvious at first sight, but it's very relevant for a town planner, because this demonstrates that somehow offer generates its own demand. What this tells us is that if you add some listings, some flats outside of the center, the tourists are likely to follow. So in some places, as you see in Siena, the blue bar, in Bari, the blue bar, in Florence as well, the blue bar is a bit taller than the green bar. The blue bar is increase in revenues outside of this, increase in listings outside of the city, divided by increase in reviews. So we consider reviews as a measure of the demand, of where people want to go. If a flat has many reviews, that means that many people want to be there. And in some cities, this is starting to happen. So new properties offered outside of the center attract more clients, so to say, than those offered, than the new ones offered within the center. Yeah, so this is the... Now this is what wrap up the summary of what we found. And then after this, I'll go into something which might be of more interest to our fellow experts in platform economy. So basically, what we found is that the absolute majority of listings on Airbnb is not rooms, it's not private rooms or shared rooms, it's entire homes. Everywhere in Italy and in the rest of the world. No? Okay. This trend is reinforcing over the years because there is more homes. Homes are increasing compared to the rest of the types of properties. The proportion of entire homes is higher in the centers than anywhere. So more homes are being offered in the center than in the rest of the city. The proportion of the housing stock that is permanently employed in short-term rental is increasing everywhere, is substantial some places, it's becoming substantial in other places, and this should probably worry the local administrations, I don't know. Then we have the phenomenon spreading, because we have the total number of homes increasing outside of the center than in the center. Then we have the issue of inequality, which is extremely high. And then we have the issue of spatial equality, which is also extremely high, as I said. So these are, I mentioned the two layers of inequality that this platform generates between hosts and between areas of the city. Am I late? Should I? Right. There's a third layer of inequality that this platform shares with all the platforms that we use, essentially. All the platforms that have some material existence in space. Think of Uber or something. What they do, they take money from you people, the users. So if I go to his house, I pay him a little bit of money to stay in his home. But then Airbnb takes a share of it. And this share is increasing. So it's almost 20%. That 20% of the money that I give to the host goes into Airbnb, which means that goes into the wealthiest part of the world, because Airbnb is in Silicon Valley, in California, where the largest amount of wealth is amassed. So using these, the same goes for Uber. When you take an Uber, you pay your driver some money, and then a chunk of that money goes again into the Silicon Valley. And en route, it goes into Jersey, it goes into some fiscal heaven, because these platforms tend to be quite reluctant in paying their taxes, So what you have is inequality increasing at the interpersonal level, at the local level, and at the global level as well. And then, finally, the data that you've seen, so all the little dots, and the data that the platform produces, so where the homes are, how many people are using the homes, how many money everybody is making, is very valuable information, as I said. Because town planners need to know these things to plan for towns. And one thing that you might have noticed, if any of you is a host on Airbnb, is that Airbnb has an algorithm that essentially suggests you how much money you should charge for your property. And nobody knows how the algorithm works, just like the rest of them. It's a property of Airbnb's, essentially. But what the algorithm does, or what the algorithm might be doing, if Airbnb wanted to, the algorithm might draw users, might draw tourists to a certain part of town by making those properties more affordable, for example. So Airbnb can do, if they wanted to, they can do the job of town planners. They can decide what part of town is mostly devoted to tourism and which part of town is not, just by working on their algorithm. They're probably not doing it because they're not interested in these kind of things. They're interested in making money, so they probably thought of the way of getting most money, as much money as possible. But think about, think if you know your town could do that. So one thing that we, so dreaming, you know, one thing that we mention in our study, if any of you will have the will venture through it, we argue that local authorities or governments should engage with the platform, should try and get the data, and should try and do very differently from what this country does. Because at the moment, the Italian approach towards Airbnb is basically to let them do whatever they want, as long as they give back some money. Okay, so they charge the city tax, they charge sort of flat rate on all the rentals, but that's about it. Instead, there's a group of colleagues from London. They were devising this mechanism. Think if the real-time data were available to your local authority, and the local authority could give and remove sharing rights. So they could decide who is able to share their home on Airbnb and who is not. So they could, for instance, decide to place some tourists in some area of the city which doesn't regularly enjoy the presence of tourists. That could be beneficial because tourists, you know, they spend money in around where they sleep, essentially. So it could be an extremely powerful tool. The data produced by the platform could be an extremely powerful tool for town planning, except that it's not, because the data are not there and won't be there for a lot of time. One last thing, and then I disappear. Airbnb doesn't have the copyright on this, you know. So one thing that local authorities can decide to do is to build a competitor, is to build a different platform which does the same thing, maybe getting less shares of it, less commission, so to say, so to encourage users to adopt the platform and leave Airbnb. That would be beneficial to the hosts, to the visitors, and to the local authority, because they would have the data necessary to plan. Okay, but this is far from reality because of the exact issue that our previous speaker were telling you about: data ownership and the way the platforms work, which act as I don't want to leave, which act as you were saying, public utilities, public services, except they're not, they're private. Okay, I'm done.